Welcome back, chess fans. In today's video, we'll be diving into key middle game principles. We'll cover general concepts, explore piece dynamics, and take a close look at different pawn structures, giving you the tools to navigate this critical phase of the game with confidence. Let's jump in and enjoy the video. Principle number one is going to be focus on finishing development. In chess, a lot of times you're going to get into positions where you're not very comfortable and you're not very familiar with the ideas of the position and the structure. However, it is very important to never neglect the development of your pieces. That means you need to have all four of your minor pieces out. In this case, one pair of knights has been traded off, or one pair knight for bishop. You need to castle the king, you need to bring out the queen, and you need to bring the rooks to the center of the board. So in a position like this, you would castle, and then you would finish development with the moves like rook c8 and rook d8. So remember, never neglect development. Always focus on finishing development. Principle number two is going to be always ask yourself, what does my opponent want to do? And in order to figure out what your opponent wants to do, you need to first look at the position and understand what ideas exist in the position. For example, this is Benoni. In Benoni, oftentimes you want to trade pieces if you're playing with the black pieces, and with the white pieces, you would like to avoid some trades if possible. More details on this position will be later on in the video, but you need to understand the ideas that exist in a position, and you need to understand what my opponent wants. For example, my opponent maybe wants bishop to g4. Let me go h3, trying to stop that. This is going to develop good habits for you, and this is going to serve you very well in the long run. Principle number three is to take is a mistake. And what does this mean? In endgames, you will often find yourself in situations where there is a lot of tension between pieces. These pieces can be knights, bishops, pawns, rooks, it doesn't matter. But sometimes whenever you capture opponent's piece, opponent is able to capture back and get a lot of activity. For example, if you take on a8 in this position, what black will do is just simply take back, and now black has the control over the open A file, and you are unable to challenge that, at least right away. So you do not want to take on A8. To take is a mistake. And now let me show you a different example. Let me go to a different position here. Let's say we have a position like this, where black castles, bishop to d3, and here we have this tension between bishops. You do not want to take this bishop on g3. If you take this bishop on g3, after hg3, the rook opens up. So to take is a mistake. And if you take with the white pieces, let's just say, let me just make a random move. If you take this, this also doesn't help you, because queen takes, and then black plays c5 quite easily, or pawn takes also should be okay. They're both sort of fine. I'm not actually sure which one is better here. They're both equal, but to take is a mistake. Let me show you an even more common example. So let's go in this chapter, and let me go to a position like this, for example. Let's say black plays c5, and we have this position where there is a lot of tension in the center of the board. Now, if you go d takes c5, what black will do is take back with a knight, and that's bad. To take is a mistake. However, in some cases, such as c takes d5, there are going to be tactical justifications for taking. So for example, in this case, this does allow black knight to get to the center, to a more active square. However, the h7 pawn is hanging. So you cannot just simply take the pawn on d5 with the knight. If you take it with the bishop, then you lose the bishop pair. That's also pretty clear. If you take it with the pawn, now you can take on c5, and if knight takes, you give your opponent an isolated pawn, and you are basically playing on the long-term advantage of the position. So the reason why I bring this example is because I want to show you that there can be exceptions to this rule if there are tactical justifications, or maybe some sort of long-term positional justifications. But remember, to take is a mistake. Principle number 4 is going to be a bad plan is better than no plan. In chess, a lot of times you're going to have an idea, but that idea is going to be incorrect, and that is okay because everybody, even masters, they have certain ideas sometimes that are not objectively the best, but they pose practical problems. So a lot of times you're going to come up with ideas that are just simply incorrect, but you still should come up with these ideas. The reason why I say that is because you do not want to be making moves mindlessly. You do not want to be playing moves like b3. You do not want to start moving just pawns randomly. This is very ineffective for your chess growth. You want to be focused and you want to make moves with intent, and you need to have an idea behind it, even if that idea is objectively incorrect, because that teaches you discipline in your thought process, and that teaches you good habits, that teaches you how to think in chess, and in the long run it's going to be much better for your chess development if you do this than if you just play random moves. So principle number 4, move with purpose, and a bad plan is better than no plan. Principle number 5 is going to be when you're getting attacked either on the king side or on the queen side, you want to be counter-attacking in the center of the board. So in this case, if white plays a move like g4, trying to go g5 and dislodge this knight from a very useful f6 square, which controls critical squares in the position, what we can do is simply counter-attack in the center. We play the move pawn to d5, and here white can even continue to push this pawn in order to remove the defender of d5, but we can actually sacrifice the knight and push the pawn because after captures we will be able to win the piece back. But in general, the reason why you want to counterattack in the center is because when you're getting attacked on the flank, a lot of times you're not going to have resources to move over to this side of the board in order to defend against the attack. However, if you open up the center, it gets significantly easier to bring resources over here and just simply defend the position. Principle number 6 is going to be when you're being attacked, you want to trade off the pieces. So in this case, white is threatening checkmate in 1 with this rook and queen battery. And the way we can deal with a move like this is that we can try to offer a queen trade. Now this does come at an expense of a pawn in this case, but a lot of times this is going to be okay. Sometimes you're going to have to sacrifice material in order to stop the attacks. So remember, when you're being attacked, try to trade off your opponent's attackers. Principle number 7 is going to be whenever there is opposite side castling, meaning one side is on the queen side and the other side is on the king side, you want to launch an attack on the enemy king with the pawns. So in this case, one of the best moves in the position for white is to play this move pawn to g4 with the idea to follow up with h4 and h5. Let's say black does the same thing, but on the queen side, of course, black wants to launch an attack on the queen side. So he plays a6 with the idea to play b5. We go h4, b5, and then we go h5. And now this is going to tie into principle number 8, which is you want to open up lines in front of your opponent's king. You basically want to strip the king of its defenders, and the pawns are of course the defenders of the king. So when we play a move like h5, our goal is to at some point take on g6 and then have access to h6, or even bring the queen to h2 and have an attack down the h file. So here, let's say black plays a move like rook to b8, we play h takes g6, let's say h takes g6 is played, we can play a move like queen h2, and then we are threatening various ideas such as removing the defender of the h7 square, bishop takes f6, and then queen h7 checkmate. So remember, whenever there's opposite side castling, that's principle 7, you want to attack your opponent's king, and principle 8 is open up the lines in front of your opponent's king. Principle number 9 is going to be identify critical squares in each opening and play the middle games based off of those critical squares. So this position that you see on the screen came out of a queen's pawn opening, so some sort of d4, d5, c4, so some sort of queen's gambit, and we know that the main squares in the queen's gambit are e5 and c5. These are the pawn breaks that black wants to achieve. Black wants to achieve at least one of these. He wants to either play c5 or e5. Now, if we are able to successfully restrict these two squares, we will have an advantage in the position. So for example, in this position, we can play a move like e5, which physically blocks the e pawn, so the e5 pawn break is no longer possible. And we can also play a move like knight to e4, controlling the c5 square. If black plays c5 now, he will have to give up the bishop pair and the pawn temporarily as well. So this is what you want to do in the middle games. So let me show you another example. Let me go to this chapter right here. This position is a Sicilian Najdorf, and here, like in the most Sicilians, the critical square is this square d5. This is where the battle is fought. If black successfully manages to play d5, black equalizes the game. So in this position, we can play a move like d5, which would liquidate the position and lead to a bunch of pieces being swapped off, which means that white does not have an advantage or maybe has minimal advantage. So this is what you want to do. You want to identify the critical squares, such as d5 in the Sicilian, c5 and e5 in the queen's pawn positions, and play the middle games based on these squares. That is what's important in these positions. Principle number 10 is trade if you're up material. So in this case, white has two extra pawns on a2 and h3, and this is more than sufficient to have a winning advantage in an endgame. So whenever you're in a position where you are up in material, you want to be trading off the pieces. Even if you are up only one pawn is generally enough. There are some cases where your opponents can defend if you're only up one pawn, but of course that is very difficult to accomplish. And more material that you're up, for example, if you're up a knight, you definitely want to trade. If you're up a bishop, you'll definitely want to trade also. And if you're up even more material, great, just trade off the pieces and honestly take the path of least resistance. If you swap off the pieces, then your material, your extra material is going to be more felt. So you want to trade off some material, but there's one thing you have to keep in mind when you're trading off some material, and that is that you do not want to trade material at the expense of your piece activity. So for example, here we see that the rooks are eyeing each other, and we just don't want to trade off mindlessly here. If we capture on d8 here, of course, or sorry, that's e8, of course we lose some of our advantage because black takes on d1, and then black can get in here and win our pawns, and of course that position leads to a draw. It's actually quite annoying to draw that because black rook is so much more active, but it is a draw. So that is why you want to be as active as possible, and if you're trading pieces, you do not want those piece trades to come at the expense of the activity of your pieces. So in this case, a move like king f1 would be perfect because it would control the infiltration squares. If opponent's rook captures, we can take with the king, no problem. We don't want to take with the rook because, as we said, that allows the rook to get active, but we can take with the king, and then we can move the king if we have to, and now we are still very active, and we have successfully managed to trade off a pair of queens and also a pair of rooks. So principle number 11 is going to be try to always go forward and try not to go back, at least in the early middle game stage of the game and towards the later stage of the opening phase. Now in this position, we do not want to be playing moves like knight to e1, for example. Some players might think that this move is not bad because we are playing the typical plan of the position, which is to move the knight out of the way and play a move like f4. But the thing is, we haven't developed any pieces yet. We haven't developed our queen side. So we do not want to be going back in positions like this whenever we haven't finished development. We want to be playing moves like maybe bishop e3, maybe knight d2, maybe even a4, taking space over here with the idea to stop b5. And we have all of these plans, but we never want to be going back, at least very early. Once you're done developing all of your pieces, then maybe you can go back and think about remaneuvering your pieces, but early in the game, you do not want to be going back. Principle number 12 is going to be improve your least active piece. So looking at this position, we have the two rooks and a bishop. Both sides have two rooks and a bishop, and black is just a little bit more active. In positions like this, you want to be thinking about what is your least active piece in the position and how do you improve it. So for example, in this case, it's this rook on a1. So you need to think about using this rook one way or another. You do not want to be making moves like rook takes, because that gives up the control of the file. Remember, to take is a mistake, the earlier principle. So you want to be improving your least active piece. In this case, your least active piece is this rook on a1, and with a move like a bishop to d2, for example, this rook has already been improved, because if your opponent captures, you can simply take back, or in a couple of moves, maybe you can move this rook up to e3 and then move this rook to e1, and that's how you can improve your least active piece. Principle number 13 is going to be centralize your pieces for maximum activity. So in this case, we have a position like this, and what we want to do is play a move like knight to e5. Now, what does the knight do on e5? First of all, it blocks the e-pawn, so the e5 pawn break cannot be achieved by black, and it also is very active, pressuring a lot of squares from its very active e5 square. So this knight is really well placed in the center, and generally pieces that are placed in the center of the board are more active than pieces that are on the side. This applies to every piece, but especially the knight, because at least bishops, rook and or queen and rooks, they are sort of long range pieces, so even if they are on the side of the board, they can still be somewhat active given certain scenarios, but this is definitely most effective for the knights, but it works on other pieces as well. So make sure you guys centralize your pieces for maximum activity. So principle number 14 is going to be transition into right endgames. In a lot of cases, you're going to be in positions like this where you're in the late middle game phase of the game and you don't know what trades to make. For example, do you trade the queens? Do you trade the bishop, knight for bishop? Do you trade knight for knight? And one of the traits of good players is the understanding of how they can go into endgames that are the best for them and that give them the best winning chances. So for example, in a position like this, if you trade the queens and if you trade knight for bishop, this will get you into an endgame where you have bishop for knight, and this is what will give you the best winning chances. In some cases, you can go rook c8. Actually, rook c8 is going to be a useful move in pretty much all of these positions. You can also go rook d8, challenge the rook, but this is what will give you the best chances versus just simply mindlessly capturing this, which doesn't even win you anything and actually just straight up gives you a losing position, because then queen attacks, threatens checkmate, and rook attacks the queen. So always be mindful into what kind of end games you want to go into, whether you want to go into knight end games, rook end games, bishop end games, what color bishop end games, etc. So remember, transition into the right end games. Principle number 15 is going to be put knights on the outposts. Outposts are squares in your opponent's position which cannot be controlled by pawns. So for example, this c5 square is an outpost. Why is it an outpost? It's because the d pawn has been pushed twice to d5. It cannot go back, therefore it cannot control the c5 square, and the b pawn has been traded off, so it cannot control the c5 square either. So in this case, we can play a move like knight to c5, and the only way to challenge this knight for black is to trade it off with the knight or with the bishop, which is very difficult to accomplish. If the bishop goes to f8, that leaves the defense of the knight, and it's also difficult for the knight to be traded off for the bishop, because if you move it here, you lose it. So you're going to need to take a couple of moves in order to set up this trade. So remember, knights belong on outposts. Principle number 16 is try to get good knight versus a bad bishop dynamic. So as you can see, this position is very similar to the last principle, except a couple of pieces have been traded off. In this case, if we were to put the knight on c5, sorry, it's black to move, but if we were to put the knight on c5, this bishop right here is a light square bishop, and this is a dark square outpost. That means that this bishop will never be able to challenge the dark square outpost because it moves around the light squares. And therefore, in order for black to even try to get rid of this knight, he would have to sacrifice the rook somehow, which is, of course, very uncomfortable. And even if you sacrifice it, you're down material. You just sacrifice the rook for the knight, and then a white can put pressure on from there. Something like this can happen in many openings. Like this can happen in a lot of Schlechter positions, a lot of Dutch defense positions, where one side has a very good knight versus a very bad bishop. So try to get this as much as possible. Principle number 17 is going to be line up batteries with bishops and the queens. So that means that you need to be able to attack this king right here with a battery. How do you do that? You play moves like bishop b1. Now, playing moves like bishop b1 could look very uncomfortable because you're blocking the rook. However, this attack or this lineup of the bishop and the queen has been known to be very strong, and the rook is fine on a1. You can get it out later. But with this battery, you are able to do a lot of damage very quickly, and it's actually very difficult to stop. It's actually near impossible to stop, because if you play g6, then you weaken the h6 pawn, you lose the h6 pawn. If you play f5, that's a legitimate move, but you can go en passant as the white pieces, and then castle, bring the rook to the e1 square, and then pressure this pawn. And you can honestly still play queen d3, because the knight has to go back, but the squares here are still weak. You can challenge this knight with moves like knight to e4, for example. So remember, line up batteries with bishops and the queens. Principle number 18 is going to be don't fix the pawns on the same color as your bishop. So for example, in this position, both sides have the light square bishops, and you do not want to be fixing your pawns on the light squares. That means you do not want to play moves like a b3, because your opponent will play b4, and now your pawns are fixed on the light squares forever. Instead, you want to be fixing your opponent's pawns on light squares. And this position that I have brought you today is an end game. It's not a middle game position, but you need to think about this concept in the middle game, because later on in the end game it will become very relevant. In the middle game, where there are still many pieces on the board, this does not matter as much, but in an end game like this one, it will make a huge difference. So you want to be very careful in terms of how you handle middle games, and you want to avoid fixing the pawns on the same color complex as your bishop. So fix the pawns on dark squares, do not fix them on light squares, because you have the light square bishop. Principle number 19 is going to be trade off your opponent's bishop pair, and of course, if you are the side that has the bishop pair, try to keep it as much as possible. So in a position like this, you want to be playing moves like bishop to f3, and you want to be getting rid of your opponent's bishop pair, especially when there are still more pieces on the board. It's going to be even more relevant, because bishops from far away can really support major attacks on the king. So you want to be getting rid of at least one of them, because that will mitigate a lot of pressure from your position. Principle number 20 is going to be whenever there are opposite color bishops on the board, you want to generate an attack. We know that in an endgame, opposite color bishops can be a draw. However, in a middle game where there are still many pieces on the board, they can actually be very useful when attacking, because one bishop cannot defend against the other one, because they fight for different color complexes. So for example, in this position, you could play a move like rook to e1, get rid of this queen from a very active square, and then play a move like rook to d3 with the idea of moving the rook to f3 and putting tremendous pressure on this f7 pawn, which is a target for the white pieces, or black has a slight weakness here on f7. It is difficult to guard this pawn. Principle number 21 is going to be take open files. So in this case, we have a rook on d1 and there's an open a file, which neither of the rooks have occupied. So what we can do in this position is go to a1. And in this case, this black rook does not have access to a8 because we're controlling that square and we are controlling the entire a file. At any moment, we can go in and attack this pawn. So principle number 21, take open files with rooks. Principle number 22 is going to be lift your rooks. A rook lift in chess is when you push a pawn in front of the rook 2 squares and then you lift the rook up. So in this case, an example of a rook lift would be something like rook to f3, and we are able to defend this pawn, which could be under fire in a couple of moves, and we can also move our rook in front of our pawns on g2 and h2 and generate an attack on this side of the board. So remember, lift your rooks. Principle number 23 is going to be putting the rooks on the 7th rank of the board. If you're playing with the black pieces, that would be 2nd rank, so equivalent of black's 7th rank. So in this case, we have 2 open files, C and D files, and what we want to do to maximize the activity of our rooks is to put them on the 7th rank. This is where the majority of pawns are going to be, and this is where we can generate a lot of pressure. So remember, put the rooks on the 7th rank. Principle number 24 is going to be blockade your opponent's passed pawn. So a lot of times in middle games, your opponents will be able to create a passed pawn in the center of the board or maybe on the flank, and what you want to do is blockade these pawns. The earlier you blockade them, the better it is going to be. However, sometimes it's going to be a bit inconvenient to blockade them on different squares, so prioritize blockading on the squares where it is convenient. So in this case, just a very simple bishop d6 does a great job. Principle number 25 is going to be knights are the best blockaders of protected passed pawns. So in this case, position is a bit closed and black has a protected passed e-pawn, which is quite strong. And the best way to blockade this pawn is with a knight. So here we can play a move like knight to e3. This bishop will get out on a different diagonal, maybe on a3. But the reason why this knight is a better blockader than the bishop or any other piece, as a matter of fact, is because it's the only one that can jump over squares, and it's the only one that can put pressure on opponent's pawns and also defend the position at the same time. If we block with the bishop, yes, we are doing a defensive task, but we're not really attacking anything. At least with the knight, we are putting significantly more pressure on these 2 pawns on d5 and f5. Principle number 26 is going to be create luft for your king. Luft in chess is breathing space. So in this case, as you can see, we cannot easily move our rook. If we were to play a move like rook to c7, putting the rook on the 7th rank, we would get checkmated on d1 because the king does not have anywhere else to go. So what you want to do is create breathing room for your king, and that can be done with any of these pawns. However, it is a bit situational which pawns you want to move. In this case, for white, you do not want to move the g pawn because you have the light square weaknesses here. Instead, you can move the h pawn, and this is totally fine. For black, it's the other way around. If black moves the h pawn, we have a bishop on b1 which controls that square, so this is really not a very useful move. But if instead black plays g6, now this bishop is blocked off, and black also has breathing room for his king. Principle number 27 is going to be put pressure on the pinned piece. So in this case, as you can see, this bishop on g5 is pinning this knight to the queen. And if black plays a move like castles, which is actually quite a severe mistake, you can play this move knight to d5 in this position, which puts extra pressure on your opponent's knight. And the thing is, this pawn has already been pushed to d6, which means that this bishop right here cannot go back to defend this, and in a move, black will simply get a bad structure. So for example, let's say black plays a move like a bishop to e6, you can capture on f6 and then play moves like bishop to h6, and now the structure has been damaged. Principle number 28 is going to be look to your pawn structure, and I'm going to introduce a new concept to you guys, which I'm going to tell you about in a moment. So let's say we have a position like this, e4, e6, we just get a French defense. Both sides are just making very simple moves here. They're both developing, and the concept that I want to introduce to you guys is this rule of following the chain. So in this case, the pawns are placed on f7, e6, and d5. So according to the rule of the chain, you want to follow this pawn chain. And the next continuation for this is the move pawn to c5, which challenges these pawns. For white, the chain is set up from b2 to c3, d4, and e5. So a natural continuation for the white pieces is going to be f5 with the correct setup, of course. So this rule of following the chain works in a lot of positions, and it tells you on which side of the board you should be playing on. If your pawns are facing this way, you want to be playing this way on the queen side. If your pawns are facing towards the king side, you want to be playing towards the king side. And this is a universal rule in chess. Let me show you another example. So I'm going to show you a King's Indian defense example here, where we get a position like this. So in this case, Black's pawns start from c7 and they go d6, e5. So Black's pawn chain is going this way. A natural follow-up is for Black to move the knight away and play this pawn break, pawn to f5. And for white, it's the opposite. Let me just go back here. What white wants to do is actually follow this chain right here. There's a knight here, but imagine there is a pawn, and there you have a pawn chain on g2, f3, e4, and d5. A natural continuation would be something like b4 and c5. So remember, always follow the pawn chain and play on the side of the board where your pawns are looking towards. Principle number 29 is going to be use your pawns to get pawn breaks to activate your pieces. So in this case, we have 1, 2, 3 minor pieces developed. We still haven't developed this dark square bishop, but what we can do in this position is challenge the center with a move like f4 and simultaneously open up our rook, which makes the rook very active as well. So pawn breaks in chess are mainly used to activate your pieces, and that's their main purpose. And f4 here does that wonderfully because it activates the rook while also putting tremendous pressure on the center of the board and not necessarily disallowing d5, but in some positions you can put a lot of pressure on the e5 pawn, which will discourage the d5 move because this pawn would simply be lost. Principle number 30 is going to be using pawns to take space on the flank. So for example, in this position, we can play a move like a5, and the idea of a move like this is to take control over some of these squares and also activate the rook on a8 without even moving it, which is quite an impressive feat, because once we get this pawn to a5 and a4, at any moment we can capture on b3 and we will have a rook on an open file or a semi-open file. So use these pawns on the flanks to take space and to get some pawn breaks in the center. In some cases, you can even go a4, a3 to challenge the structure. If this pawn is on b2, for example, instead of b3, a4, a3 challenges that pawn quite effectively. Principle number 31 is going to be to use space advantage in chess. Now, what is space advantage? As you can see in this position, we have a pawn on d5 and we have a pawn on e4. And let's focus on the pawn on d5. So unlike any other pawn in the position, d5 is the only pawn that has crossed our opponent's territory. As you can see, these 4 files are our opponent's territory, and this is our territory in chess, and the pawn on d5 is the only one that has crossed that line and made it to the enemy territory. Black does not have any pawns in our side of the board. Now, what does this mean? This means that we have more space in the position and we're controlling squares. We're, for example, stopping the knight from accessing this c6 square, and we're also stopping the bishop from accessing this e6 square. And what space advantage does in the position is that it restricts our opponents. Now, if black wants to develop the knight to d7, he has to block in the bishop. If black wants to develop the bishop to d7, then there are no good squares for the knight, and maybe the knight has to go to a6, which is not entirely the most comfortable square. So the point is, whenever you have more space in chess, you want to avoid trades as much as possible. So in this position as white, if you were to play a move like bishop e2, this is an okay move, but black will go bishop to g4, make this exchange, and get rid of one of his problematic pieces. But if we play a move like h3, we stop bishop g4, and now black is forced to make some sort of a decision. Does he block in the bishop, or does he put the bishop on d7? And this all leads to uncomfortable positions for the black pieces. So whenever you have a space advantage in chess, you want to keep pieces on the board, and whenever you lack space and you're getting restricted, you want to trade off some pieces. Principle number 32 is going to be to use fishhook. So what is fishhook? As you can see in this position, there's a pawn on h6 that is attacking the knight on g5, and what we can do here is play this move pawn to h4 in order to defend the knight. We're not actually defending the knight, we're more defending it tactically, I should say. Now in this case, the pawn cannot capture the knight on g5 because that opens up the rook. This is actually not even the best move. The best move is to go bishop to h7 first and then queen h5 and only now open up the rook. But let me just show you the idea here, which is to open up this rook on the h file, and this is what the fishhook does. You have a piece on g5, it can be the knight or it can be the bishop, defended by h pawn, and once this pawn captures the piece back, you open up the rook. This is a very dangerous idea, and most of the time the piece that's on the g5 square, or the piece in question in general, cannot really be taken. Principle number 33 is going to be to use flank pawns in order to chip away at opponent's structure. So in a lot of positions, you're going to notice that your opponents are going to have these sorts of structures with a6 and b5, sometimes with h6 and g5 on the other side of the board. And what you need to know here is that you can chip away at these structures with moves like pawn to a4, threatening the pawn on b5, threatening to open up the a file. Now, if this pawn is pushed forward, what we can do here is get this c4 square. So we can push the pawn on d3, and then we can remaneuver the knight to d2 and then go to c4 to pressure this pawn on e5. If there are pawns on h6 and g5, of course we don't challenge them with a4, we challenge them with h4. So this right here, these flank pushes, are a fantastic way to challenge these structures. Principle number 34 is going to be avoid isolated, doubled, and backwards pawns. So as you can see in this position, we have an isolated pawn on h6, we have doubled pawns on f7 and f6, and we have a backwards pawn also on f6. Now this is not an ideal structure to have in chess, and generally in chess you would like to have your structure intact and not have any of these sorts of positions. Now, doubled pawns in themselves are not always bad. They're very situational. In my opinion, they deserve their own separate video, which is what I'm probably going to work on next. But if you can, try to avoid isolated, doubled, and backwards pawns. Principle number 35 is going to be don't weaken squares unnecessarily. When you push pawns in chess, you have to keep in mind that those pawns can never go back. So in this position, if you were to play a move like h6, let's say this bishop retreats to h4, h6 is a fine move. However, if you keep going with this pawn push, and actually push the pawn to g5, this bishop will drop to f2, and now you have a problem because you pushed h6 and g5, you pushed the pawns on dark squares, you have weakened the light squares, especially this f5 square, and it is actually quite easy for white to access this square. The knight will go from e2 to g3 and to f5, and this is a big problem because this bishop is a dark square bishop and it cannot challenge the knight on f5. So if these two pieces are swapped off, we can easily find ourselves in a good knight versus a bad bishop scenario. So principle number 35, don't weaken squares unnecessarily. Principle number 36 is going to be to create targets. So in this position, what we can do is we can capture this knight on c6 twice, because after bishop captures, pawn captures, we will be able to triple our opponent's pawns, and we can also swap the pawns off the board here. And after takes and bishop takes c5, we see that black has doubled pawns on the c file. Even though black is up a pawn, this does not mean much in this specific case because these pawns are so bad. And what we have right here is what's called targets. What we can do is we can go queen a4 and attack all of these pawns, and even if we're able to win one back, like let's say we win back the c4 pawn, this pawn will still remain a target, but because our pawns are together, they're intact, our pawns are not as much of targets as the pawn on c6. So make sure you guys create targets in your opponent's position that are easy to attack. Principle number 37 is going to be to identify weak squares in opponent's position. Now, what is a weak square? A weak square can be an outpost, or it can be a square that cannot be easily defended by our opponents. So for example, in this case, d6 is a weak square. We can easily access it with knight c4 and knight to d6. And this is also an outpost. Every outpost is a form of a weak square, but weak squares in general entail more than just outposts. So for example, in a lot of positions, maybe f7 can be a weak square because you can target that square easily. That's just an example. Of course, in this position, that's not really the case. But what you want to do is identify which squares can not be defended easily by your opponents and try to access those squares as much as possible. So in this case, a move like knight c4 and then knight to d6 would be quite great. So principle number 38 is going to be to trade off your weak pieces. So after e4, e6, d4, d5, let's say we go into the advanced French position. And as you know, in the French defense, this bishop on c8 is weak. Now, how do we identify that this is a weak piece? Well, first of all, we have to look at the pawn structure. As you can see, all of the central pawns, well, except the c pawn, are on the light squares. This is a light square bishop. That means that the bishop cannot jump over these pawns, so it's stuck behind the pawn chain. So what you want to do is try to trade this bishop off. If your opponents ever play a move like bishop to b5, for example, let's just say we have a position like this. Bishop to b5 is already a very, very bad move because of bishop d7. And then after an exchange, let's say queen takes, this position is, or I would even say this is already better for the black pieces because you traded off your problematic piece and you have a little bit of an extra development because this queen is on d7. It can easily access this b5 and this diagonal in general, making it difficult for white king to castle. That is why these sorts of bishop b5 moves are not very good because they get rid of your problematic pieces. But of course, a good player will not play a move like bishop to b5, and because of that, we have to rescue this bishop on our own. So we can play moves like bishop to d7, for example, knight to f3, and even a6. This is one of the variations that you can play in the French defense, and the idea with a6 is that you want to play bishop to b5. Let's say bishop to d3 is played, bishop b5, and then we are successfully able to trade off the light square bishop, which is the problematic piece for us, and this is also a very nice variation. So make sure you guys identify which one of your minor pieces is problematic and try to trade that off for your opponent's good counterpart. Principle number 39 is trade off your opponent's key defenders. So most of the time, whenever your opponents have a fianchettoed bishop, that fianchettoed bishop is one of the key defenders of the position. So oftentimes it is a very good idea to go bishop to h6 and trade this bishop off. This bishop on g7 controls the entire diagonal. If the knight ever moves, there is pressure in the center, there's pressure on the knight on c3, there's pressure on b2. However, if we are able to play bishop to h6, we're able to trade off this very strong bishop, which leaves black with weak dark squares, as you can see. Principle number 40 is going to be get rid of your weaknesses. So in this position, as you can see, we have a weak pawn on d6, which is being severely pressured. And actually the white rook is about to arrive on d1, pressuring this pawn even further. However, what we can do in this position is actually play this move pawn to d5, which offers the exchange between these pawns. And if it is accepted, we are successfully able to trade off one of our weaknesses. Even if it's not accepted, even if the pawn is pushed to e5, now we can jump the knight in and we have actually solved most of our problems. Even though the pawn's going to remain here, we have managed to activate our knight quite effectively. So make sure whenever you guys have weaknesses such as an isolated pawn, you are able to get rid of them by trading it off for another pawn. And the reason why this pawn is not as weak as d6, this is also an isolated pawn on e4, but the problem is it's only targeted by the knight, and it's very difficult to target this with anything else. Like, for example, if you bring the rook to e8, you're going to have to move both of these bishops in order to target this pawn. That's kind of difficult to accomplish because white can get to this pawn faster. So you have to be very careful. You have to get rid of your weakness. Principle number 41 is going to be, if you're going to trade off bishop for knight, make sure that you replace the pawns with the same color complex as the bishop that you just traded off. So let me show you this in practice. If white plays a move like h3 here, we can take on f3 and we can play this move e6. And what I want you guys to notice is that in this position, majority of our pawns, and more importantly, the central pawns, are all on the light squares. And this is very important because we just traded off the defender of our light squares. We don't have the light square bishop anymore. Somebody has to control the light squares, and the pawns will do a good job of that. And our dark squares are of course monitored by our beloved dark square bishop. And I will show you another example of this. So let me go here. This is going to be one of the variations in the Nimzo-Indian defense, where we go, let me just show you this from the beginning. After queen to c2, knight to c6, knight to f3, d6, what we are doing is we are preparing to trade off this bishop for knight and then replace the pawns on dark squares, in this case, not the light squares, by pushing this pawn to e5. So let's say a3 is played here, we can capture, and then we can play a move like queen e7, preparing this pawn push to e5. So let's say white plays a move like b4, we can play this move e5. So we have traded off our dark square bishop and we have replaced the pawns on dark squares. And this is very important when you're trying to maintain control over certain color complexes in your and also your opponent's position. And finally, principle number 42 is going to be, if you're going to take a piece with a pawn and double your pawns, you want to be taking towards the center. So for example, in this case, if you go for f takes g3, this does create some weaknesses for you in the position. Now, granted, black has to take advantage of these quite quickly in order to make use of this structure, otherwise you will be able to push for e4, but most of the time you do not want to be taking away from the center. You want to be taking towards the center instead. There are going to be some very rare cases where you do take away from the center, but majority of the times it is taking towards the center what is correct. So this is what I want you guys to do, but every position is different, so just keep this in mind. Most of the time you want to take towards the center. There's going to be some cases where you want to take away from the center. That's going to be it for today's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.